Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Mirada wash processed Ecuador from Moxie Coffee Co. And there's the bag right there. And Moxie, based out of Phoenix, Arizona. And they were a suggestion to us by Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy, and One Man's Chorus. So a quick shout out to and thank you to Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy, and One Man's Chorus for the suggestion. This is Moxie's second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed a hybrid processed Colombian coffee about a year ago at this time. In addition to that, this coffee was picked up for us by our good friend Greg as he was out at Moxie's coffee shop in Phoenix. He found this coffee, sent us a photo, and we asked him if he would be willing to send it to us, as Moxie was on our suggestion recommendation list and it was a wash processed mejorado. So we definitely wanted to review this coffee, and interestingly enough, I never saw this coffee on Moxie's website. So I don't know if they ever offered it online or if it's something that you could only purchase in store, but I'm very grateful that Greg was able to pick it up for us, and I'm looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, on a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, I do have to say that this one did turn out significantly more developed than I was expecting going into it, given that we did have one review of one of their coffees in the past, and I'm not entirely sure if it's just the direction that they went with for this coffee, or maybe it went a little further than they were looking to go with this one. But this one is a bit closer to that true medium, as it's much more developed than a lot of the coffees we identify as being on the more developed side of a medium light. It's maybe perhaps a slightly lighter medium, but it's actually pretty close to just being a true medium roast by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression through the V60, and that was definitely the biggest takeaway I had, as the coffee definitely had a notable bit of development to it. As soon as I opened up the bag and took out the beans, I was really surprised at just how dark they were, and I fully expected that to translate into the coffee itself, which it did. However, it was balanced out by an abundance of red berry aspects with a higher than expected level of brightness, as it was still presenting an above average level of sweetness with that red fruit chew like scent. So in a lot of ways it reminded me of a more developed Kenyan coffee, especially in terms of those red berry qualities and that sweetness. So it was definitely an interesting first impression, and I was very curious to see where this coffee would go from here. Day 20 through the Chemex, and the coffee is still notably more developed than expected, as it does hinder the overall experience, and it must be noted and highlighted because it was just a fair bit more developed than even I would necessarily say. Like I've said in the past, that when it comes to Kenyan coffees, there may be the one origin that I'm fine with being slightly more developed. There's a slight bit of a, we'll say, guilty pleasure when it comes to those. But this one right here, on the other hand, for being a mejorado coffee, I was just really surprised at how intense it was in that sense, with it being reminiscent of what I would describe as some red and purple colored fruit chews, a long-lasting smokiness, which was very tricky and kind of contrasted the overall experience to it. So a lot of positives. There are so many positives with this coffee. It was just negated by how smoky and roasty it was. Day 23 through the April brewer, and there's still some issues with the overall experience, as there's a very interesting intermediary part which offers what I would describe as being an almost rich plum-like sense, followed by such a strong roasty component that did hinder the overall experience. And it's in a lot of ways somewhat maddening with this coffee, because there's just so much beauty within this coffee, but at the same time that strong roasty quality just seems to hinder that somewhat fleeting experience to it. Day 26 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, 15:1 at 93 degrees Celsius, and there were some mixed results, as it does help tone down some of the roastier qualities, but as a result you weren't getting that very strong fresh fruit feeling. And when I did experience that plum-like quality to this one, I was very happy with that coffee, but it just seemed to be too fleeting and not consistent enough to really enjoy in the extent that I would like. Instead, it was giving it a much more robust Kenyan feel, as there's a lot of tart red fruits to it, and it just made for a consistently interesting experience. Day 29 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the development once again does still continue to dominate the experience of this coffee, with the red fruit aspects being the secondary components to it. Sweetness remains very high, and I continuously go back to the sweetness because it is still a very sweet coffee, with a lot of the fresh fruit qualities a little less noted when we do go lower on the extraction. Day 32 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it felt like maybe the coffee might have dropped off a little bit with time, as it does offer a little bit less of that strong ripe fruit intensity, skewing a bit more on a generic candied red fruit quality off brew, but still not necessarily holding up well in the cool down with a prominent roastiness in the finish once again. Day 35 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was the best the coffee had been to this moment. So even though I thought that maybe it dropped off, there was a little bit better of an experience this time around, as there was a, we'll say, enjoyable, sweeter, fresh fruit component right off brew. And this is where we have some notes, and I described it as being reminiscent of plums, coconuts, illicit grape, though the coffee did lose a lot of its structure the more it did cool down. Day 38 final notes we have through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and there were struggles for consistency with this coffee, as it did not have the same level of fruit intensity that it did on the previous day. Instead, much more of the roastiness and a very strong caramelized experience this time around. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 4s, so let's go through those. We'll go start with the finish, level 4. And the finish, it was, I will say, mostly the roasty qualities within this coffee, because it did have some really nice fruit components, but as this coffee was cooling down and it did have that lingering, long-lasting finish to it, it was just kind of the roasty, smoky qualities of this coffee. So level 4 where we opted to put it, but not necessarily ideal in that sense. Sweetness, level 4. It is a very sweet coffee. It's still a mejorado, and I think this is an interesting experiment in what happens if you do go a little bit more developed on a mejorado coffee. Will it still be as sweet? And the answer is yes. It's just fighting a battle against a very strong smoky and roasty quality in this case. But outside of that, there's a candied sweetness, there's a fruit sweetness, there's a sugary sweetness, there's a caramelized sweetness. It's very mejorado in that sense, and just very, very sweet. One of the more sweet, extremely, I don't want to say extremely, but pretty developed coffees that we've ever had. So interesting in that regard. We will move on. Berry fruit, level 4. Right from the onset, this coffee reminded me of a Kenyan coffee, just a very, very sweet Kenyan coffee, which in a lot of ways, I suppose, works for me. But those berry fruit tart aspects to it, definitely pretty prominent within this coffee. I think it's something that they have listed on here. I could have it wrong, but I think it's pomegranate, something along those lines, but very tart and bright in terms of the fruit qualities within this one. Go ahead and move on to the level 3s. We will start with the acidity level 3. So one of the first things I noticed was that there was an abundance of brightness, but the more we worked with this coffee, I would say that it did seem to dial back and get a bit more toned down with time. So not necessarily quite as bright as that first impression. Level 3 kind of decided to keep it in that middle ground sense. Plurality, level 3. I think one of the other notes they have listed on here is an orange blossom. I did see a little bit of a citric floral component within this coffee. Granted, it's drowned out by the more roasty, smoky qualities of this coffee. So level 3, where we opted to put it, as it is also one of those fleeting qualities within this one. Citrus fruit, level 3, and I feel like we highlighted a citric quality, maybe not, but there was a slightly generic citric component to this one as well, nowhere near as prominent as the other fruit qualities in this coffee, a little less defined given it's not the cleanest coffee. So level 3 where we opted to put it. Stone fruit, level 3. On certain days it could have been that level 4. I shouldn't even necessarily say certain days. Certain times within the coffee it could be a level 4. As there's this very rich and enjoyable fresh plum experience to this one, but it was also fleeting. Level 3 where we opted to put it. Let's go ahead and move on. Caramel, level 3. Definitely an abundance of caramelized sweetness to it. That's probably what's going to happen when you have a more developed mejorado coffee. Very rich, very sugary, very intense in that sense. One of the more enjoyable experiences of this coffee. And then a couple more things we're discussing. We'll start with the body, level 3. It definitely had a fair bit of texture to it, and we've always said in the past with mejorado coffees that can be either a 2 or a 3. I don't think I've seen them go higher or lower, but given that this is a bit more developed version of that coffee, I probably expected it to be on that higher end of things. And then the final 2 things we're discussing, we'll discuss them side by side. Smokiness, level 3, cleanliness, level 3. Obviously, those 2 correlate with each other, as the cleanliness is greatly hindered by the smoky quality within this coffee. I really don't know what happened. I can't imagine that this is the direction that Moxie goes with most of their coffees, but it's also a coffee roaster that I don't have a lot of experience with in general. So maybe this is the profile of their coffees, or maybe this one just got away from them a little bit. But again, I was so surprised to see how developed the beans were for this coffee. And of course, we include a photo of the beans in each review, so it'll be at the start of this video if you're curious. But it wasn't maybe to the same extent where it was overly oily in that sense, where that's probably skewing closer towards a dark profile. But even then, as far as coffees we review go, I can't quite recall having too many that were this developed that offered this much of a roasty, smoky quality, which did take away from the cleanliness. At the same time, there was really nice definition to the stone fruit quality when it was presented. There was really nice definition to the berry fruit and sugary sweetness to it. So there's enough cleanliness to keep it at that level 3 mark minimum. But outside of that, that smokiness is going to hinder the overall experience for a wash processed coffee. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It was very mixed because I did appreciate the sweetness that it did offer. So I feel like the Mejorado was carrying this one pretty heavily. And I'm still at a loss for what happened with this coffee, if this is genuinely the direction that Moxie wanted to go with it, which is fine if that's the case. There are actually a couple of other more developed Mejorado coffees that we are working on that I very much enjoy as well. So I don't necessarily think that going a little bit more developed with Mejorado coffees will hurt them too much, because as long as they're still offering that intense sweetness, and in some aspects, I feel like the sweetness is actually a little better when they are pushed a little bit more. That's not to say that I necessarily would prefer Mejorados to be this developed, but it's to say that there's definitely some charm that does come from them having this, we'll just say, heavy, more developed quality to them. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It still does lean on the more traditional side of things, so a more classic coffee drinker, as it does have a little bit more body and texture. It does have that acidity, brightness toned down. The fruit qualities are presented, but not overbearing. And at the same time, it is very sweet. So somebody that does like their more traditional coffees, but presented in a very sweet sense, I feel like this one's an ideal fit for you. It seems to go along very well with those preferences. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, or for that matter, anything from Moxie, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, or them as well, if this is maybe a one-off for them, because again, I don't and can't imagine this is the profile that they usually have for their coffees. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Linda Mirada, wash processed Ecuador from Moxie Coffee Co. Thank you for watching.